On January 27, 1973, the Paris Peace Accords, also known as the Agreement on Ending the War and Restoring Peace in Vietnam, was signed by the Democratic Republic of Vietnam, the Republic of Vietnam, and the United States, officially ending American involvement in the nation. After 2 decades of American involvement in Indochina, the United States was finally ready to leave. There are many aspects which led to the withdrawal of American troops from Vietnam, one being the undeniable fact that victory could not be achieved, even after hundreds of millions of dollars and thousands of lives were poured into the effort. However, the military operational aspect of the war was complemented by a secondary effort at home, one which was not in favor of military action. Thus, to introduce this American Studies research presentation, I will begin by discussing my main research topic, the anti-war movement during the Vietnam era. I chose this topic because I have a particular interest in United States Cold War policy, specifically the American involvement in Vietnam. As well, in the past I have often researched and written about the military aspect of the war. For this reason, I thought it would be interesting to look at the domestic realm of the war and the influence of social movements on America's military operations abroad. The anti-war movement, also known as the peace movement, was not a single movement, but instead combined elements of both student movements and civil rights movements. For my research purposes, I would like to focus more on the student aspect of the anti-war movement. The broad categorical nature of the movement makes it particularly interesting to research, and I wanted to find out whether or not this social movement actually had any significance in ending American involvement in the war. The image of the tank on the right is a picture of the North Vietnamese ramming through the gates of South Vietnamese presidential palace in Saigon. I chose this picture to demonstrate how even after years of fighting, millions of dollars, and countless lives lost, the Americans and South Vietnamese could not hold back the North. I believe this image represents how defeat was inevitable and proves why so many chose to join the peace movement and fight back against the war, as there was no possibility the Americans could win. It shows that all the bloodshed was essentially for nothing. Next, I will discuss my chosen research question for this presentation. I'm asking, how did the youth anti-war movement in the United States impact the Vietnam War, and was it successful in ending American involvement in Vietnam during the 1960s and 1970s? Going into this assignment, I recognized that there were anti-war protests across the United States. However, I did not realize the extent of the movement or whether or not it was successful. Of course, the anti-war social movement did not directly force the American government to withdraw its troops from Vietnam and eventually sign a peace agreement. However, I asked this question because I wanted to research and understand whether or not the movement was successful in any aspect, or if it was an utter failure and a waste of time for the American participants at home. Some further questions I would like to answer are how historians of the Vietnam War viewed the anti-war movement compared to how historians of social movements viewed it, as well as in what ways was the movement successful to these two groups. Historians of the war itself may argue that the movement failed as the fighting continued in Vietnam for many years regardless of their protests. However, historians of social movements would likely argue the anti-war movement was successful in bringing about the gradual withdrawal of American forces from Vietnam. Further research will be needed to fully understand the answers to these questions. The Vietnam War is a topic which has been researched and discussed thousands of times, and so there's endless literature on the subject. This made narrowing down my sources somewhat difficult, as the number of sources is quite extensive. That being said, I was able to use the Western Library search engine Summon to pull multiple relevant scholarly sources for my topic. To begin my research, I started with a piece of gray literature from History.com on Vietnam War protests to get a general understanding of the topic. Although this was not a scholarly source, it provided basic knowledge by breaking the topic into 3 categories: the beginnings of the movement, widespread disillusionment, and the political consequences of the protests. This helped me narrow down my research terms for more academic sources. An additional piece, which is significantly important to my research, is An American Ordeal, the Anti-War Movement of the Vietnam War by Charles de Bendetti and Charles Charfield. I found this book in the D.B. Weldon Library. De Bendetti was a renowned historian and scholar with a specific focus on the peace movement and the Vietnam War, making his book the perfect piece for my research topic as it covers a variety of subtopics related to the Vietnam anti-war movement. Of course, there are many other sources which I will use for my research, but these 2 were particularly important as they provided a basis to get me started on more specific details about my topic. Before discussing my preliminary thesis, I would like to discuss how the anti-war movement relates back to the course themes such as American exceptionalism and the American dream. The Vietnam War directly relates to the idea of American exceptionalism, that America is the bearer of freedom and liberty and morally superior. America entered into Vietnam as a way to combat communism abroad and spread their moral values of freedom and democracy. There was a strong belief that America was exceptional and that others should and would accept these American values. However, the victory of the North Vietnamese proved this idea wrong. In addition, many returning veterans from the war chose to protest the fighting after they themselves had seen the atrocities of war and recognized that America may not be exceptional after all. The Vietnam War and the anti-war movement also relate to the American dream in 2 ways. The war itself demonstrates how the American dream is a myth. It did not matter how hard America worked to win the war, how much money was put into it, and how many soldiers' lives were lost, they simply could not be successful. This disproves the theory of the American dream, that hard work will always pay off. On the other hand, the American dream is proven through the success of the movement. After years of protesting and hard work, the movement can be deemed successful. Therefore, after researching this topic, I've created a preliminary thesis which states, while the anti-war movement did not have an immediate effect on ending the war, it was instrumental in the gradual withdrawal of American troops from Vietnam, as anti-war sentiment increased over time, pressuring the United States government to accept the end to combat operations in the region. I would argue that overall, the anti-war movement was, to an extent, successful in bringing an end to the American involvement in Vietnam. The movement included students, civil rights activists, and even returning veterans, and demonstrated a social upheaval in American culture. This is just my preliminary thesis and will need to be further researched before coming to a final conclusion. From the research I have currently conducted, I can conclude that my thesis can and will be proven correct. Thank you for listening to my presentation on the anti-war movement during the Vietnam era.